Today, I'm going to be testing something people said wouldn't even work. I've got a few graphics cards that officially shouldn't even be able to launch Flag Resynced. But we're going to find out if the system requirements are telling the truth. So, first up, let's see how the GTX 1650 handles the game.
And this is the less superior GDDR5 model from 2019. With only 4GB of VRAM, we're keeping things fairly light, running the game at 1080p on the very low preset, with motion blur disabled and AMD FSR set to balanced. Now, before we get into the results though, there's one important thing to mention. The upscaling in Flag Resynced is actually kind of so the presets don't work properly at all. To actually fix it, you have to set the dynamic resolution scale to 100%, as originally it was set to 80%, which means it's just 80% of 1080p. It might as well just be 720p. So basically, Ubisoft did a cheat code to get that 30 FPS. Also, after adjusting the resolution scale, then I had to manually adjust the FSR scaling to 34%. Which is what the balanced preset is actually supposed to be. I'll also be doing the same thing for the performance preset later on in this video. So to keep things simple, whenever I mention either the balanced or performance with upscaling, then that's actually the manually fixed settings I'm referring to. So, with those settings, the GTX 1650 averages 43 FPS, which honestly isn't too bad since we're still getting an experience that's above 30 FPS overall. The 1% lows are at 4 FPS, while the 0.1% lows drop to just 1 FPS. So yes, that stuttering is definitely noticeable, but even so, it's still kinda playable. It's not quite enough to hit that 60 FPS target, but before we move on to the next graphics card, let's turn on frame generation and see if it can give us that extra boost we're looking for. Once again, the GTX 1650 is running the exact same settings, but this time I've switched on AMD frame generation. It does add a little bit of input latency, but while you're actually playing, it's barely noticeable. And what you do notice though is just how much smoother the game feels compared to before. This is one of those situations where frame generation is actually really sensible. As long as you're getting around 30 FPS or more, turning it on, it can completely change the experience. The game suddenly feels much more fluid and enjoyable. Now, Ubisoft recommends a GTX 1660 for 1080p at 30 FPS, which is fair enough. But what's really strange is they also recommend it for ray tracing. However, the GTX 1660 doesn't even have dedicated RT cores. And since I'm using the slightly slower GTX 1650, I left ray tracing turned off. It's only software ray tracing anyway, and on a card like this, the performance hit is just not worth it. As for the results, the GTX 1650 actually holds up pretty well. It averages 61 FPS with a 1% low of 23 and a 0.1% low of 4 FPS. So yes, the stutters are still there, but with AMD frame generation enabled, they're much less noticeable. The game feels actually smoother than the numbers may suggest, and overall, it's surprisingly playable. Next up is the GTX 980 Ti, a graphics card that launched way back in 2015. Now, even though it's 4 years older than the GTX 1650, this was Nvidia's flagship GPU at the time. Comes with 6GB of VRAM and a massive 336GB per second memory bandwidth, giving it a huge advantage over the 1650. And just like before, we're testing at 1080p, but this time using the low preset with AMD FSR set to balanced. For comparison, the GTX 1650 uses a 128-bit memory bus, while the GTX 980 Ti has a much wider 384-bit. The wider bus is a big part of why the 980 Ti delivers so much more memory bandwidth, which really helps in a game like Flag Resynced. The GTX 980 Ti averages 55 FPS with 1% lows of 45 and 0.1% lows of 7 FPS. Compared to the GTX 1650, this game feels much smoother overall. The occasional stutter is still there, but it's far less noticeable yet again, making for a much more consistent experience. And for a graphics card that's over a decade old, the GTX 980 Ti still holds up surprisingly well, thanks to that extra VRAM and huge memory bandwidth. It actually delivers a better experience here than the newer GTX 1650. Next up is Intel's Arc A380. We're still running at 1080p on the low preset, but this time I've got XESS set to performance with frame generation turned on. And since this is an Arc card, I also enabled resizable bar, because these cards really don't like running without it. Now, I'll be honest, the first time I tested this card, it was awful. I was using an older driver. Frame generation wasn't working properly, the game kept crashing, and the input lag made it totally unplayable. Now, after updating to the latest drivers and firmware though, it was like a completely different card. This time around it averaged 66 FPS, with 1% lows of 28 and 0.1% lows of 24 FPS. Compared to the GTX 980 Ti, the Intel Arc actually manages a higher average frame rate, but the 980 Ti still feels a bit smoother overall, thanks to its much better memory bandwidth. The A380 relies more on XESS frame generation to boost performance, but it's still pretty impressive considering this card isn't officially supported. Gaming isn't really why I bought this card though. Most of the time it's sat in my Plex server handling video transcoding, and it's absolutely brilliant for that. Next up is AMD's RX 580, and once again we're running at 1080p using the low preset, with motion blur turned off, AMD FSR set to performance, and frame generation enabled. This is where things really start to get interesting. The RX 580 averages 76 FPS, with 1% lows of 60 and 0.1% lows of 35 FPS. What's really impressive is that this card came out in 2017, and it's not even listed on Ubisoft's recommended specs list. Instead, they recommend much newer cards like the RX 6600 XT, of which is quite a bit more powerful. But even so, the RX 580 still delivers a really solid experience. By now, it's pretty clear that having 8GB of VRAM makes a huge difference in this game. The 4 and 6GB cards could run it, but they were much more likely to stutter. The RX 580 just feels much smoother and more consistent. For a graphics card that's 9 years old, it's aged incredibly well, and if you've already got one in your PC, I don't think there's any reason to upgrade just quite yet. It might not match Ubisoft's recommended hardware on paper, but it still delivers a surprisingly good experience. Now it's time for the GTX 1070, and once again we're testing at 1080p using the low settings with motion blur disabled and AMD FSR set to balance with frame generation turned on. Performance with the GTX 1070 averaged 82 FPS, with 1% lows of 60 and 0.1% lows of 42 FPS. Now, I must admit that this result genuinely surprised me. When the GTX 1070 launched back in 2016, it was one of Nvidia's flagship gaming GPUs at the time. And 10 long years later, it's still putting up a decent fight thanks to its 8GB of VRAM. But compared to the RX 580, the GTX 1070 offers a much better overall experience. Performance isn't flawless, but it feels much smoother than the 4 and 6GB cards we tested earlier. That extra VRAM allows textures to load properly. There's much less stuttering, and overall the experience is a lot more enjoyable. It's also worth remembering that the GTX 1070 isn't actually on Ubisoft's recommended specs either. Instead, Nvidia recommended cards like the RTX 3060 12GB, which is a much newer GPU with features like DLSS and dedicated ray tracing cores. Even so, the GTX 1070 proves you don't necessarily need the latest hardware to enjoy the game. And if you're buying used, it's still great value. Here in the UK you can usually find one for around £70 to £90. And for a graphics card that's 10 years old, It's aged remarkably well. It's more than capable of playing Black Flag Resynced with the right settings. The last card we're testing today is the RTX 3060 Ti. This is the first GPU in today's video that actually meets the recommended system requirements. So I wanted to see what it could really do. For this test I pushed the settings up to the high preset at 1080p. Motion blur was turned off, DLSS was set to balanced, and I left ray tracing disabled. Personally, I don't think the visual upgrade is worth the big hit to performance, especially when the difference is pretty hard to notice while actually playing. The RTX 3060 Ti averaged 73 FPS, with 1% lows of 56 and 0.1% lows of 25 FPS. So, what did we actually learn today? Well, this test actually proves why I think Ubisoft's supported GPU list is a load of Just because a graphics card isn't sitting on Ubisoft's official list doesn't mean it suddenly can't run the game. Every single unsupported GPU I tested managed to actually launch Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced, and some of them performed way better than I expected. The GTX 1650 was definitely fighting an uphill battle, but with frame generation enabled it became a much smoother experience. The GTX 980 Ti showed that older high-end cards still have plenty of power left, and even the Intel Arc A380, which had a rough start because of driver issues, ended up being a surprisingly capable little card after an update. But the biggest shock of the entire test was the GTX 1070. This card is a decade old now, yet it delivered one of the best overall experiences out of everything I tested. That really makes you question just how useful the recommended list from Ubisoft, with their infinite wisdom, actually really is. The thing these benchmarks showed is that the VRAM matters a lot in this game. The 8GB cards were clearly more comfortable, with a smoother gameplay and fewer issues compared to the lower VRAM cards. And then we have the RTX 3060 Ti. Unsurprisingly, it handled the game well. But the funny thing is, you don't actually need a modern recommended GPU to enjoy Black Flag Resynced. So while Ubisoft's spec list might be safe, I don't think it tells the whole story. There are plenty of older cards out there that aren't supported, but can still deliver a perfectly decent experience. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing. If you don't, well, thanks for the watch time. I appreciate the contribution to the algorithm anyway. I'm David James, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.
And done. It, that'll do.